The vanishing at Black Hollow Lake. It began like any other summer evening in the quiet town of Chestnut Ridge, Pennsylvania. Nestled deep in the Allegheny Mountains, the town was a postcard of serenity. Green hills rolled for miles and Black Hollow Lake sat in the center like a dark jewel. For the locals, it was a place of picnics and fishing, until the night Lila Dunn disappeared. Lila, a 22-year-old college student home for the summer, was the kind of person people noticed. Vibrant, adventurous, and always with a camera slung around her neck, she'd planned to document the wild beauty of Black Hollow Lake for a photography contest. On July 15th, she kissed her mom goodbye, promised to be back by sunset, and drove her beat-up Jeep down to the lake. She never came home. When the search began the next day, everyone expected an easy resolution. The area around the lake wasn't particularly treacherous, and Lila was experienced in the outdoors. Yet no trace of her was found. Her Jeep was still parked in the gravel lot, keys in the ignition, her backpack on the passenger seat. Her camera was gone. Theories swirled. Had she fallen into the lake? Run away? Been abducted? Weeks passed, and despite extensive searches by police and volunteers, Lila remained missing. The lake, once a place of joy, grew eerily silent. Locals avoided it, muttering about cursed waters and strange happenings. I wasn't from Chestnut Ridge. My name is Owen, and I'd recently moved to town for a teaching job. The story of Lila's disappearance intrigued me, and I found myself drawn to the lake's dark mystery. On a warm August evening, I decided to visit Black Hollow Lake. The sun dipped low as I arrived. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I approached the water, a peculiar chill settled over me. I brushed it off. The lake was eerily still, its surface glass-like. A mist clung to the edges, curling around the rocks like ghostly fingers. I stood on the dock, staring out at the water. Something compelled me to stay, though I couldn't explain why. Then I saw it, a faint ripple as if something large had moved just beneath the surface. My breath hitched. There were no fish large enough to make that kind of disturbance. The ripple moved toward the center of the lake, then vanished. It was getting dark. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, carried on the breeze. Owen? I froze. The voice was soft, almost melodic. It sounded familiar. My heart raced as I scanned the shoreline, but no one was there. Shaking off the unease, I hurried back to my car, determined not to return. Yet that night I couldn't sleep. The voice echoed in my mind, and when I closed my eyes, I saw the ripple, impossibly vivid. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, but it grew stronger. Shadows seemed to linger in the corners of my vision. Whispers floated on the edge of hearing. One evening as I returned from work, I found something on my doorstep. A camera. An old, beat-up DSLR. I recognized it immediately. It was Lila's. My hands trembled as I picked it up. How had it ended up here? The police had scoured the lake and surrounding areas. They'd never found her camera. Fighting the urge to call the authorities, I brought it inside and sat at my desk. The battery was dead, so I rummaged through my drawers for a charger. When I powered it on, my stomach twisted. The memory card was still inside. There were dozens of photos, most of them mundane, shots of the lake, trees, and sunsets. But as I scrolled through, they grew stranger. One showed ripples in the water, though no one was there. Another captured a shadowy figure on the shore, indistinct and blurry. And then the final photo. It was a selfie of Lila taken on the dock. Her wide smile and sunlit hair were at odds with the terror in her eyes. Behind her, rising from the water, was a figure. Its form was twisted and unnatural, its face, if it had one, shrouded in darkness. I dropped the camera, heart pounding. The room felt colder, as if the very air had been sucked out. The following nights were a waking nightmare. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. My reflection in the mirror seemed off, as if it were a fraction of a second behind my movements. I began to dream of the lake, of standing on the dock while something massive and ancient stirred beneath the surface. One night, I awoke to find my bedroom window open. The camera sat on the windowsill, pointed toward the woods behind my house. Against my better judgment, I reviewed the photos. The last image chilled me to the core. It was me standing on the dock at Black Hollow Lake, though I hadn't been there in days. My face was pale, my eyes hollow. I couldn't take it anymore. The lake was calling to me, pulling me like a magnet. On a moonless night, I drove there, the camera slung over my shoulder. The mist was thicker than ever, curling around my legs as I walked to the dock. The air was deathly still. As I stood at the edge of the dock, The water began to ripple, concentric circles spreading outward. My reflection in the lake stared back, but it wasn't me. Its face was gaunt, its eyes dark pits. It smiled. A hand shot out of the water, skeletal and dripping, its grip like iron. I screamed as it pulled me forward. The last thing I saw before I plunged into the freezing water was the camera, lying on the dock, its lens trained on me. They found my car the next morning, abandoned by the lake. The dock was empty, save for an old camera. The photos on it told a story the police refused to believe. A shadow rising from the water, a man being dragged below, and finally, the still surface of the lake, undisturbed and eternal. Black Hollow Lake is quiet again. But if you stand by the shore at sunset, you might hear the whispers calling your name. If you thought that was scary, wait until you hear this next story. The Haunting of Pine Haven Forest. In the fall of 1998, 4 friends set out for a weekend of camping in Pine Haven Forest, a sprawling wilderness in northern Maine. The forest, with its towering pines and serene, moss-covered trails, had a reputation for being beautiful but remote. That isolation was precisely what drew Sarah, Jake, Melanie, and Chris. They wanted an escape from the noise of their lives, a chance to unplug and reconnect. They arrived late on a Friday afternoon, their SUV packed with gear. Jake, always the planner, had mapped out a spot deep in the woods, far from any established trails. No cell service, no people, he had said with a grin. Just us and nature. The hike to their campsite took longer than expected. By the time they reached it, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. They hurried to pitch their tents and start a fire. The forest grew unnaturally quiet as night fell, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves absent. Melanie joked about how spooky it felt, but her laughter was strained. That night, they sat around the fire, trading ghost stories and sipping from a flask Jake had brought. The flames danced, casting flickering light on their faces. As the stories grew darker, an uneasy tension settled over the group. Sarah, ever the skeptic, rolled her eyes. "You guys are just trying to freak each other out?" Chris opened his mouth to reply but stopped. His head tilted, his brow furrowing. "Do you hear that?" The others fell silent. At first there was nothing. Then it came, a faint rhythmic tapping like something hard striking wood. It was distant but distinct. "Woodpecker?" Jake suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. The tapping grew louder, closer, then stopped abruptly. They stared into the dark trees, their firelight unable to penetrate the shadows. No one moved. Minutes passed but the sound didn't return. "Probably just the wind," Sarah said, trying to dispel the unease. They nodded, though none of them truly believed it. One by one they retreated to their tents, but sleep came slowly. Sometime after midnight, Sarah woke to a strange sound outside her tent. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, closer. Then came the tapping. It was sharper now, deliberate. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound was coming from the direction of the fire pit. Summoning her courage, she unzipped her tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly. Beyond it, she saw movement, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the campsite. Her heart thundered in her chest. The figure was tall, its features indistinct. It seemed to sway slightly as if caught in a breeze. Then it stepped forward into the dying firelight. Sarah stifled a gasp. The figure wasn't human. Its body was elongated, with arms too long and thin, its face a featureless expanse of pale, glistening skin. The creature tilted its head as if listening. Then it turned sharply and vanished into the darkness. The tapping sound followed, fading into the distance. Sarah stayed frozen, unable to move, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. In the morning, Sarah recounted what she'd seen. Jake laughed nervously, dismissing it as a bad dream. "You're just freaked out from the stories last night," he said. Melanie nodded, though her eyes darted toward the trees. Only Chris seemed to take Sarah seriously. "What if she's right?" he asked. "What if there's something out here?" Jake groaned. "Come on. We're in the middle of nowhere. There's no one else out here." But as they packed up their gear for a day hike, Chris noticed something strange. The ground near the fire pit was disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. The others brushed it off, but Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The day passed uneventfully, the forest bathed in golden sunlight. By the time they returned to camp, their earlier fears felt silly. They rebuilt the fire, cooked dinner, and even laughed about Sarah's hallucination. But when they woke the next morning, Chris was gone. His tent was unzipped, his sleeping bag empty. At first, they thought he might have gone to relieve himself, but an hour passed with no sign of him. They searched the area, calling his name, but the forest swallowed their voices. Then they found it, a single muddy footprint near the edge of the campsite. It wasn't Chris's. Panic set in. Jake insisted they stay together, but Melanie was frantic, running ahead and shouting for Chris. Sarah tried to call 911, but her phone had no signal. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees casting long, ominous shadows. The rhythmic tapping returned, faint and distant, following them no matter where they went. By dusk they were hopelessly lost. The tapping grew louder, closer, echoing through the trees. Melanie screamed, spinning in circles. "Where is it coming from?" she cried. Suddenly she stopped, her eyes wide. "Do you see that?" They turned. In the dim light they saw it, the same figure Sarah had described. It stood motionless, its head tilted. Then, with an unnatural speed, it darted out of sight. That night, they huddled together around the fire, their backs to the flames, watching the darkness. The tapping surrounded them now, an oppressive rhythm that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. Jake gripped a hunting knife, his knuckles white. Around midnight the fire began to die. As the shadows deepened, Sarah noticed movement in the trees. Shapes emerged, not just one figure but many. They circled the campsite, their pale, featureless faces glowing faintly in the dark. The tapping grew deafening, coming from all directions. One by one the figures stepped closer. Jake lunged at the nearest one, but it moved with impossible speed, sidestepping him effortlessly. Melanie screamed as cold, bony hands reached for her. Sarah tried to run, but something tripped her. She fell, her head striking a rock, and darkness consumed her. Weeks later, a group of hikers stumbled upon the campsite. The tents were torn, the fire pit cold. Of the campers there was no sign. Only a single object remained, a blood-stained hunting knife, embedded in the ground. The hikers didn't stay long. The forest felt wrong, oppressive. As they hurried back to civilization, one of them paused, glancing over their shoulder. For a brief moment they thought they saw something standing among the trees, watching. Then it was gone. Brace yourself, because the next story is even more disturbing. The silent floors of Willowgate Hotel. For decades, the Willowgate Hotel loomed in the heart of downtown Chicago, a towering relic of the 1920s. Once a luxurious haven for the city's elite, the hotel fell into disrepair after a string of mysterious deaths in the 1970s. Rumors swirled. Suicides, accidents, and unexplained disappearances had plagued the upper floors. By 1982, the building was shuttered, its grand halls left to decay. The urban legend, however, refused to die. People whispered about the silent floors, levels 12 through 14, where the bulk of the tragedies had occurred. Some claimed the floors didn't exist on blueprints, while others swore they could hear faint music and laughter echoing from above, despite the hotel being empty. A few brave souls who sneaked in reported encountering shadowy figures and hearing whispers in the dead of night. None stayed long enough to see if the stories were true. I'm Claire Jennings, an independent journalist with a penchant for the paranormal. The Willowgate's dark history was too tantalizing to resist. When I heard that the city planned to demolish the building in a few months, I knew it was my last chance to uncover its secrets. Equipped with a flashlight, a camera, and a digital recorder, I entered the abandoned hotel on a cold November evening. The air inside was musty, thick with the scent of mildew and rot. My footsteps echoed eerily as I made my way through the lobby, its once opulent chandeliers now hanging like skeletal remains. Graffiti covered the walls and shattered glass crunched beneath my boots. I felt it immediately, an oppressive heaviness as if the building itself was watching. The elevator was out of order, so I climbed the grand staircase, each creak of the wood setting my nerves on edge. My goal was clear: reach the silent floors and document whatever I found. The staircase ended abruptly at the 11th floor. A thick chain and a "Do Not Enter" sign blocked access to the higher levels, but I had come prepared with bolt cutters. The chain snapped with a metallic groan and I pushed the door open. The 12th floor was dark, save for the faint glow of my flashlight. The air was colder here, my breath fogging in the beam of light. The hallway stretched endlessly, lined with peeling wallpaper and warped wooden doors. Some doors were ajar, revealing rooms in varying states of decay. One contained a shattered mirror, another held a toppled wardrobe. But what struck me most was the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was void, as if sound itself had been drained from the floor. I set up my camera in the middle of the hallway, aiming it toward a particularly foreboding door at the end. As I adjusted the angle, a faint sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart pounded as I swept the flashlight around, but nothing appeared out of place. Then I heard it again. Louder. Closer. It wasn't random, it was deliberate like footsteps. My recorder picked up faint whispers, unintelligible but insistent. Gathering my courage, I approached the door at the end of the hall. It creaked open on its own as I reached for the handle. The room was empty, save for a set of stairs leading upward. These stairs weren't on any blueprint I'd researched. The air here was heavier, almost suffocating. Every instinct told me to turn back, but curiosity overruled fear. I climbed. The 13th floor was pristine, untouched by the decay that plagued the rest of the hotel. The carpets were clean, the wallpaper intact, and faint jazz music floated through the air. A party was in full swing. Men and women in 1920s attire filled the hall, their laughter and chatter reverberating around me. But something was wrong. Their movements were too fluid, too synchronized, as if they were part of a film on a loop. Their eyes were empty, devoid of life. No one acknowledged my presence, though they moved around me as if I weren't there. I raised my camera, snapping photos, but the lens fogged over. When I checked the digital screen, the images were distorted, the figures blurred and warped. My flashlight began to flicker. "You shouldn't be here," a voice whispered behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The music warped, slowing to an unnatural crawl. The laughter turned into screams. The partygoers stopped, their heads snapping toward me in unison. Their empty eyes filled with malice. I ran. My only thought was escape, but the hallway stretched endlessly, twisting and shifting. The stairs I had come up were gone, replaced by another door. It was marked 14, though the number looked as if it had been scratched into the wood by claws. I had no choice. I pushed through. The 14th floor was a nightmare. The walls pulsed as if alive, oozing a dark, viscous liquid. The air was thick with the stench of decay. Shadows writhed on the walls, their forms barely human. I felt them watching, felt their hunger. A guttural voice echoed, deep and otherworldly, "Stay with us?" I stumbled backward, tripping over something soft. Looking down, I saw a pile of personal belongings. Wallets, purses, and cameras, all covered in dust. Names were scrawled on the walls, some crossed out, others freshly etched. My name was among them. The shadows closed in, their forms solidifying into grotesque figures. Their hands reached for me, cold and skeletal. My flashlight died, plunging me into darkness. I woke outside the hotel, lying on the cracked sidewalk. My camera was gone along with my recorder. The entrance was sealed as if no one had entered in years. I ran home, desperate to convince myself it had all been a dream. But the photos on my phone told a different story. They were clear, vivid. The partygoers, the twisting hallways, the oozing walls. And in the final image, taken from the 14th floor, was a shadowy figure staring directly at the lens. Its face was mine. Now, for another dark and haunting tale that will send shivers down your spine. The shadows of Crescent Hollow. Crescent Hollow was the kind of town you drive past without noticing. Tucked away in the Appalachians, it had once been a thriving mining community. But after the mine collapsed in 1964, killing 37 workers, the town dwindled. By the 1980s, it was deserted, a ghost town swallowed by the forest. Stories about Crescent Hollow lingered, passed down like folklore. Locals whispered about strange lights in the woods and voices that carried on the wind. Some claimed that the miners' spirits never left, trapped beneath the rubble. Others spoke of something older, something that had been there long before the town. For me, Crescent Hollow was an opportunity. I was a documentarian specializing in the supernatural, and the town's tragic history and eerie reputation made it the perfect subject. On a crisp October morning, I packed my gear and set off, determined to capture the truth. The road to Crescent Hollow was a narrow, winding path barely visible beneath fallen leaves. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows over the derelict buildings. The town was exactly as I'd imagined. Rows of crumbling houses, rusted street signs, and an old church with a leaning steeple. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. I parked my car near the town square and began filming. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud as I moved through the empty streets. The buildings seemed to lean toward me, their broken windows like eyes watching my every move. It wasn't until I reached the old general store that I noticed something strange. The door, hanging off its hinges, creaked open as I approached. Inside, the air was colder, the shadows deeper. Shelves stood empty save for a few rusted cans. And then I saw it, a single set of footprints in the thick layer of dust, leading deeper into the store. I followed the footprints, my heart pounding. They ended abruptly in front of the counter. As I stood there trying to make sense of it, I heard a sound that froze me in place, a faint, raspy whisper. "Get out." The voice was barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. No one was there. Swallowing my fear, I pressed on, determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. As night fell, the town grew darker than I thought possible. The forest seemed to encroach, its branches twisting like claws. I set up camp in what had once been the town hall, barricading the door with old furniture. My camera recorded everything, the red light blinking like a heartbeat. Around midnight, I woke to a strange noise. It was a rhythmic tapping, faint but insistent. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the room. The tapping grew louder, coming from the windows. I shone the light outside and gasped. Figures stood in the square, barely visible in the pale moonlight. They were indistinct, their forms shifting like smoke. Their faces were featureless, but I could feel their eyes on me. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural hum that reverberated through the walls. By dawn, I knew I couldn't stay another night. But as I packed up my equipment, I felt an unexplainable pull toward the mine. It was the heart of Crescent Hollow's tragedy, and I couldn't leave without seeing it. The entrance was sealed with rusted chains, a weathered sign warning trespassers to stay away. But the chains were loose, the padlock broken. I slipped inside, the air growing colder with every step. The mine was a labyrinth of tunnels, the walls lined with jagged rock. My flashlight flickered, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to move on their own. Deep within the mine, I found a cavern filled with strange markings etched into the walls. They weren't the work of miners, they were older, primal. The symbols twisted and spiraled, their meaning incomprehensible but undeniably sinister. In the center of the cavern was a pit, its edges worn smooth. A faint sound rose from its depths, a distant, mournful wail. As I leaned closer, something moved in the darkness. A hand, pale and skeletal, reached out, grasping at the edge of the pit. I stumbled back, my flashlight falling from my grip. In its beam, I saw them. Dozens of figures climbing from the pit, their bodies impossibly thin, their eyes empty voids. I ran. The tunnels twisted, disorienting me, but I didn't stop. Behind me, the wailing grew louder, joined by the sound of shuffling footsteps. The air seemed to press against me, making it hard to breathe. Just as I thought I'd never find the exit, I saw daylight. Bursting out of the mine, I didn't stop running until I reached my car. The figures didn't follow, but the oppressive feeling lingered. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Crescent Hollow was gone, swallowed by the trees. I returned home, but the experience stayed with me. My footage was corrupted, the files filled with static and distorted images. The few frames I salvaged showed the figures, their shadowy forms barely distinguishable. I tried to share my story, but no one believed me. Crescent Hollow remains a ghost town, its secrets buried. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping on my windows. And I know they're still watching. That was only the beginning. Let's see what horrors await us in the next story. The Echoes of Ravenwood Asylum. Ravenwood Asylum had stood on the outskirts of Fairhaven, New York, for over a century. Built in the late 1800s, it was intended as a refuge for the mentally ill, though its methods were anything but humane. Electroshock therapy, ice baths, and lobotomies were routine treatments, and whispers of unmarked graves in the nearby woods spread among the locals. After a string of patient disappearances and a particularly gruesome riot in 1963, the asylum was shut down. Since then, Ravenwood had been abandoned, its Gothic architecture weathering into a grotesque monument to its dark past. Yet it never truly stayed silent. Urban explorers and thrill-seekers claimed to hear screams echoing through its halls, see lights flickering in empty windows, and feel unseen hands brushing against them. Most left shaken, vowing never to return. When I read about Ravenwood, I knew I had to document it. My YouTube channel, Haunted Horizons, thrived on exploring places like this. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and audio recorders, I convinced two friends, Eli and Tasha, to join me. We planned to spend an entire night inside. We arrived just before sunset, the asylum silhouetted against a crimson sky. The iron gates hung open, their hinges rusted and twisted. Ravenwood's facade was imposing, tall spires, boarded windows, and a front door that hung ajar like a gaping mouth. The air was heavy, tinged with the scent of mildew and rot. "This place is cheerful," Eli joked, his nervous laugh echoing off the cracked pavement. Tasha rolled her eyes but stayed close to him. Inside, the asylum was a labyrinth of decay. Peeling wallpaper revealed messages scrawled underneath. nonsensical ramblings and desperate pleas for help. The floors groaned beneath our weight, and the air seemed colder than it should have been. I set up my camera in the main corridor and started recording. It didn't take long for things to get strange. As we explored the east wing, a distant sound stopped us in our tracks. The faint echo of footsteps, though the building should have been empty. We froze, listening as the steps grew louder, moving toward us. "Hello?" Tasha called out, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. I glanced at Eli, who shook his head, mouthing, "Let's go." But something compelled me to press on. We found the records room in the west wing. Despite the years of abandonment, many of the patient files remained intact, though their pages were yellowed and brittle. I picked up one labeled Subject 1038, Anna Wren, dated 1957. Anna's photo stared back at me, a young woman with wide, terrified eyes. The file detailed her treatment, isolation, electroshock, and experimental surgeries. Scribbled in the margins were notes from the doctor in charge. Patient claims to hear voices in the walls. Reports of shadows that speak. Treatment ineffective. Recommend transfer to lower ward. A chill ran down my spine as I read. Before I could say anything, Tasha gasped, dropping the file she was holding. "What is it?" Eli asked. She pointed to the corner of the room. I saw something move. We all turned our flashlights toward the spot. There was nothing but an old filing cabinet. Still, the room felt oppressive, as if we were being watched. The air grew colder, and a faint whisper brushed past my ear. "Leave." Despite the warning, I couldn't leave without exploring the lower ward mentioned in Anna's file. We found the entrance behind a locked metal door in the basement. The padlock was rusted, but Eli managed to break it with a crowbar. The air beyond the door was icy, and the narrow staircase descended into darkness. The walls were damp, streaked with something that looked like rust but smelled metallic. Our flashlights flickered as we reached the bottom. The lower ward was unlike anything we'd seen. Cells lined the walls, their doors hanging open. Inside were rusted metal beds and restraints, as if the patients had been left in the middle of treatment. But the most disturbing thing was the graffiti scrawled on the walls. "They're here. Don't trust the light. Anna sees." As we moved deeper, the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and incomprehensible. Tasha clung to my arm, her flashlight shaking. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just a little further," I replied, though I was terrified myself. We entered a large room at the end of the corridor. In the center was an old operating table, its leather straps still intact. Surgical tools lay scattered on a nearby tray, rusted and bloodstained. On the far wall, someone had written a single word in large, jagged letters: "Run." The moment we stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind us. Tasha screamed, and Eli rushed to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew deafening, transforming into agonized screams. The temperature plummeted, and our breath fogged in the air. Then we saw her. A figure stood at the edge of the room, her outline barely visible in the dim light. Her head tilted unnaturally, and her eyes glowed faintly in the dark. She stepped forward, her movements jerky and inhuman. "Anna?" I whispered, though I didn't know why. Her mouth opened, but the sound that came out wasn't a voice. It was a cacophony of wails and whispers, a chorus of agony that made my ears ache. The walls seemed to close in, the room warping and twisting. The last thing I remembered was the floor giving way beneath us. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. A hiker had found me unconscious at the edge of the asylum grounds. Tasha and Eli weren't as lucky. Their bodies were recovered from the collapsed basement, though the coroner couldn't explain the state they were in. Their faces were frozen in expressions of pure terror, and their eyes were gone. The footage on my camera was corrupted, filled with static and shrieking sounds. Only one frame was clear: Anna Wren staring directly into the lens, her glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Ravenwood Asylum was demolished shortly after, but I still hear the whispers. Late at night, when the world is quiet, they call my name. Our next story takes us deeper into the darkness. Hold on tight. The Vanishing Woods. It started as a simple hiking trip. Anna, a quiet and reserved 27-year-old, wanted a weekend escape from her monotonous office job in Chicago. She had read about the Black Hollow Trail, a secluded route in the dense woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, renowned for its stunning views and serene atmosphere. Despite its beauty, Black Hollow had a darker reputation, the site of several unexplained disappearances over the decades. But Anna was skeptical of the folklore surrounding the trail. People loved to invent ghost stories about places they didn't understand, she thought. She packed her gear, checked the weather forecast and set out early Saturday morning. The drive up was uneventful, the highways giving way to winding rural roads flanked by towering pine trees. The air grew cooler as she ventured deeper into the wilderness. When Anna arrived at the trailhead, the parking lot was empty except for an old, rusted pickup truck. She stepped out, breathing in the crisp forest air, and shouldered her backpack. The trail stretched ahead of her like a dark vein carved into the dense greenery. There was no cell service this far out, but she wasn't concerned. She had a map, a compass, and enough supplies to last 2 days. The first few miles were peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the path in golden light. The only sounds were the crunch of her boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves as squirrels darted through the underbrush. She passed a wooden sign that read, "Warning, trail not maintained beyond this point." Beyond it, the path became narrower, the trees pressing closer together. The air felt heavier and the silence was almost tangible. Still, Anna pressed on, eager to reach the scenic overlook she'd read about. Around noon she reached the overlook, a rocky outcrop that jutted out above a steep drop. The view was breathtaking, an endless expanse of forest stretching to the horizon, broken only by the glint of a distant lake. She sat on the edge eating a granola bar and sipping water, feeling a rare sense of tranquility. But as she packed up to leave, she noticed something odd. Carved into the rock at her feet was a series of strange symbols. Circles, lines, and jagged shapes that didn't resemble any language she knew. They were weathered as if they'd been there for decades, maybe longer. She snapped a photo with her camera, feeling a faint unease. As Anna descended back into the woods, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The sunlight grew dimmer, even though it wasn't yet late afternoon. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the ground, and the forest seemed eerily quiet. There were no birds, no insects, only the sound of her own breathing and footsteps. Then came the smell, a faint acrid odor that made her wrinkle her nose. It was sulfurous like rotten eggs. She looked around but saw nothing unusual. Shaking off her discomfort, she pressed on, determined to reach her planned campsite before dusk. By the time she arrived, the unease had settled into a gnawing tension in her chest. The clearing she'd chosen felt wrong. The trees circled the space like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting together overhead, blocking out most of the light. The ground was littered with strange, blackened patches where no grass grew. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, the product of being alone in unfamiliar territory. Anna set up her tent, started a small fire, and forced herself to eat dinner. That night, the forest came alive with sounds. At first, it was the usual rustling of nocturnal animals. But as the hours passed, the noises grew stranger. There were distant whispers, too faint to make out but unmistakably human. Twigs snapped just beyond the glow of her dying fire as if someone, or something, was circling her camp. Anna clutched her flashlight, her knuckles white, scanning the darkness. The beam illuminated only trees and shadows. She tried to rationalize it. The whispers could be the wind, the snapping branches a deer. But deep down she knew something wasn't right. At some point she must have dozed off because she woke with a start to a new sound. A low, guttural humming, rhythmic and hypnotic, emanating from the woods. It seemed to vibrate in her chest, growing louder and closer. Panic surged through her as she realized it was coming from all around her, surrounding her campsite. Grabbing her flashlight and knife, she stumbled out of the tent, her heart pounding. The clearing was empty. The fire had burned out, leaving only smoldering embers. The humming stopped abruptly, plunging the forest into an oppressive silence. Then she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall and thin, its silhouette impossibly dark, as if it absorbed the faint light around it. Anna froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. Summoning every ounce of courage, she shouted, "Who's there?" No response. The figure remained still for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, it melted into the shadows, vanishing as if it had never been there. Trembling, Anna backed into her tent, zipping it up and clutching her knife. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, she decided to cut her trip short. Packing up quickly, she set off back toward the trailhead. But the forest seemed different now, the path unfamiliar. The landmarks she'd noted the day before were gone, replaced by dense thickets and unfamiliar clearings. Panic set in as she realized she was lost. She checked her compass, but the needle spun erratically, refusing to settle on a direction. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker, as if twilight had come early. The sulfurous smell returned, stronger this time, making her gag. Her water was running low, and her legs ached from trudging through the uneven terrain. Then she saw it, a cabin nestled among the trees, its wooden exterior warped and weathered with age. Relief flooded her. Maybe someone there could help her find her way back. But as she approached, dread coiled in her stomach. The cabin didn't look abandoned, yet it didn't look lived in either. The windows were intact, but they were blackened as if coated with soot. The door was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Anna hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, but desperation overruled her fear. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, filled with a strange assortment of objects. Animal bones hanging from the ceiling, jars of unidentifiable substances lining the shelves, and symbols carved into the walls that matched the ones she'd seen at the Overlook. A sense of wrongness permeated the air, as if the space itself was alive and watching her. Then she noticed the photographs. They were pinned to the far wall, dozens of them, each one showing a different person. Some were old and faded, others more recent. Her blood ran cold as her eyes landed on the most recent photo. It was of her, taken from behind as she sat at the Overlook earlier that day. A sound behind her made her whirl around. The door slammed shut, and the low humming began again, louder and more insistent than before. This time, it was accompanied by whispers, overlapping voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Anna backed away, her flashlight trembling in her hand, until she hit the far wall. The symbols carved into the wood began to glow, pulsing with a sickly green light. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were deafening. And then everything went black. When Anna woke up, she was lying on the trailhead parking lot, her backpack beside her. The rusted pickup truck was gone, and the lot was bathed in early morning light. Her body ached and her clothes were filthy, but she was otherwise unharmed. She checked her camera, but the photos she'd taken on the hike were gone. Only one image remained, a blurry shot of the cabin, its door wide open, and a shadowy figure standing just inside. Anna never went hiking again. To this day she can't explain what happened in the woods. Black Hollow Trail remains open, and more hikers disappear there every year. But no one ever finds the cabin, and those who return never speak of what they saw. And now, onto a tale that's as eerie as it is unforgettable. The house on Elm Street. It was the kind of house you'd avoid even on the sunniest of days. Nestled at the end of Elm Street, the dilapidated Victorian mansion was a local legend. Children dared each other to run up to its front porch, and teenagers told stories of strange lights flickering in its windows. For decades, the house had sat vacant, rotting from the inside out. But when Michael and Sarah Kaufman moved to the small town of Grayson, they saw opportunity where others saw only decay. "It's a fixer-upper, but think of the potential," Sarah had said, her eyes shining with excitement. Michael wasn't so sure. There was something about the house that set his nerves on edge. The way the windows seemed to glare at him like hollow eyes, the sagging porch that groaned in the wind, and the stories locals whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. Still, Sarah was determined, and Michael had never been good at saying no to her. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. They tore out moldy carpets, painted over faded wallpaper, and replaced broken fixtures. During the day, the house felt almost normal, even inviting. But at night, a different energy seemed to take hold. The floorboards creaked as if someone were pacing in the rooms above. Doors that had been shut would swing open without explanation. Michael dismissed it as the quirks of an old house settling, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The first real incident happened on a Sunday night. Sarah was asleep upstairs, and Michael was in the basement, sorting through boxes left by the previous owners. Most of it was junk: yellowed newspapers, rusted tools, and moth-eaten clothes. But one box caught his attention. It was old, the wood warped and stained, and it was sealed with a heavy iron padlock. Intrigued, Michael brought it upstairs and placed it on the dining room table. "What's that?" Sarah asked the next morning, eyeing the box over her coffee. "Not sure. Found it in the basement. Thought we could open it later." Sarah wrinkled her nose. "It's probably full of dead mice or something gross." Michael laughed, but he couldn't shake the sense of unease the box gave him. That evening, he pried it open with a crowbar. Inside was a collection of old photographs, yellowed and curling at the edges. The images were strange, each one more unsettling than the last. A group of people standing in a circle, their faces obscured by dark smudges. A woman standing at the foot of a staircase, her expression twisted in terror. A child sitting in a chair, his eyes wide and empty. The last photo made Michael's blood run cold. It was a picture of their house, taken from the street. In the upper left window, a shadowy figure stood watching. Sarah tried to brush it off. "It's just a trick of the light," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Michael didn't argue, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the photo wasn't a trick. That night he dreamed of the house. In his dream he was standing in the upstairs hallway, the walls pulsing like they were alive. A door at the end of the hall creaked open, and a voice whispered his name. He woke in a cold sweat, the sound of his name still echoing in his ears. Over the next few days things escalated. The house seemed to come alive, its malevolence seeping into every corner. Lights flickered even when the wiring had been replaced. Sarah's cat refused to enter certain rooms, hissing and clawing at the air. At night, Michael and Sarah would hear voices, low, guttural murmurs that stopped the moment they opened a door or turned on a light. Then came the night Sarah disappeared. They had been watching TV in the living room, trying to distract themselves from the oppressive atmosphere. Sarah got up to make tea, but she never returned. At first, Michael thought she was playing a joke, but when he went to the kitchen, she was gone. Her phone was on the counter and the kettle was boiling, but there was no sign of her. Panic surged through him as he searched the house, calling her name. Every room was empty, but the air felt heavy as if something unseen was watching him. When Michael reached the basement, the door was ajar, though he was certain they'd closed it earlier. He descended the creaking stairs, his flashlight casting long, flickering shadows. "Sarah?" he called, his voice trembling. The basement was empty except for the box of photographs, which now sat in the center of the floor. The pictures were scattered around it, but one caught his eye. It was a new photo, one that hadn't been there before. It showed Sarah standing in the basement, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Behind her was the shadowy figure from the earlier photo, its form now clearer, more defined. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Michael backed away, his heart pounding. As he turned to flee, the basement door slammed shut, plunging him into darkness. The air grew cold and the low, guttural murmurs began again, louder this time, surrounding him. Something brushed against his arm and he dropped the flashlight, its beam flickering out. In the pitch black, he felt a hand grip his shoulder, its touch icy and unnatural. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the house empty. Michael and Sarah were never seen again. The only clue was the box of photographs, left open on the dining room table. Among the old photos was one final image. Michael and Sarah standing in the basement, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Behind them loomed the shadowy figure, its hollow eyes staring directly at the camera. The house on Elm Street remains vacant to this day, and the townspeople refuse to go near it. Some say they still see lights flickering in the windows at night, and others claim to hear voices when the wind blows just right. But no one dares to enter for fear of joining Michael and Sarah in the photographs. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling stories. And hit the bell icon to never miss an update.